Hey guys, hope you're doing great today. In this video, I'm diving into the incredible story how Napoleon became Emperor of France. So sit back and relax. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more calming history content. The wind off the Mediterranean carried salt and silence. On the island of Corsica, in a modest stone house beneath the shadow of olive trees, a boy was born in the year 1769, Napoleon Bonaparte. Not yet a name to echo through cathedrals. It's just a child, restless, intense. With eyes like coals buried deep in snow, Corsica had just been sold by Genoa to France. The ink was still wet, the wounds still raw, and the boy. He was born a French subject, but raised a Corsican rebel. His father, Carlo, embraced French opportunity, took the family name to Paris, dressed in powdered wigs and velvet coats. But his mother, Letizia, stayed proud, hard, watchful, and Napoleon. He remembered the mountains, the smell of gunpowder from Corsican uprisings, the names of men who died with grit between their teeth. At age 9, he was sent to mainland France, a scholarship to a military academy. There they laughed at his accent, his stiff clothes, his strange name, but he did not laugh back. Instead, he studied, silently, obsessively. He read Julius Caesar until the pages tore. He memorized the battles of Alexander. He learned how empires are built and how they fall. At 15, he entered a military school in Paris. By 16, he was a lieutenant in the French artillery. And then, the world around him collapsed. The French Revolution arrived not as a wave, but as a storm. In 1789, the Bastille fell. Heads rolled, laws broke. Kings were no longer sacred. Power was no longer divine. The world had cracked. And from the cracks, men like Napoleon began to rise. He watched the old nobility scatter like ashes. He watched priests lose their pulpits. He watched generals hesitate, unsure which government would rule tomorrow. But Napoleon, he did not hesitate. He saw chaos and stepped toward it. In 1793, he took his first command, the Siege of Toulon. The city had fallen into royalist hands, aided by British warships. Napoleon devised a bold surgical artillery assault. The French recaptured the city. With it, Napoleon earned a promotion to brigadier general. At 24 years old, a Corsican outsider, now a name whispered in Parisian salons, he was ambitious, but quiet, calculating, but not yet cruel. Still, he saw the pieces on the board and began to move them. That same year, the Jacobin fell. Robespierre was guillotined. France spun again into new chaos. The Directory took power, a clumsy, divided five-man government. Napoleon, meanwhile, remained in the shadows, writing letters, making connections, waiting. And in 1795, when royalists threatened Paris, he was called upon again. He did not hesitate. With a whiff of grapeshot, he cleared the streets. Cannon fire against French citizens. Swift, brutal, efficient. Paris was saved. The Directory owed him. They gave him command of the army of Italy. They're far from the salons, far from Paris. He became something more. Not just a soldier, not just a commander, a force of nature. Italy was bleeding when he arrived. The army was hungry, the officers drunk on old medals, the maps were lies. And yet, Napoleon saw not a mess, but a stage. 26 years old, he rode into chaos with silence in his wake. Not tall, not handsome, not adored, not yet. But in his eyes, there was something sharp, something waiting. He didn't fight like the others. He didn't wear bright uniforms. He studied terrain like a sculptor reading marble, struck fast, unpredictably, like lightning across a battlefield soaked in doubt. And with each victory, Arcola Rivoli Mantua, he did something new for a general. He wrote about himself. Pamphlets, letters, glorious exaggerations printed and scattered like autumn leaves across France. Each sentence wrapped in fire, each paragraph a crown. To the public, he was no longer just a soldier. He was a myth in motion. Painters captured him mid-charge. Printers etched his name beside Mars and Caesar. And to the soldiers, barefoot, frostbitten, starving, he was something holy. He shared their meals. He praised them as the children of victory. And they followed him into hell for it. But even myths must evolve. In 1798, he sailed to Egypt. Not for conquest, not yet, but for legacy. To walk where pharaohs once ruled. To drape his name in the robes of the ancients. It began in triumph. The Battle of the Pyramids. "Us soldiers," he said, 40 centuries looked down upon you, but shadows grew. Da-da-da. The British fleet under Nelson shattered the French ships at the Battle of the Nile. The desert turned sour. The dream faded into dust. And Napoleon left, abandoned his army. Quietly, swiftly, while they withered in the sands, he returned to France, where power waited. Paris was cracking again. The Directory had grown weak, greedy, indecisive, afraid, and Napoleon knew it was time. In November 1799, he staged a coup. It was not loud. There were no riots, just precision, a kind of quiet violence that doesn't echo. It hums. He entered the legislature, wrapped in soldiers, claimed protection, claimed necessity. And when resistance stirred, he dissolved it. By evening, the Directory was gone. And in its place, the consulate, 3 men, they claimed, would rule France. But everyone saw the truth. There was only one that mattered. First Consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. The revolution had devoured its kings, priests, and tyrants. It had promised liberty, fraternity, equality, and yet the people cheered as one man seized it all, 'cause he brought order, bread, pride. He was not royalty. Not yet, but he was their sword. And soon he would become their crown. Paris awoke to the sound of hooves on frozen stone. It was December 2nd, 1804. The sky hung heavy with winter gray. And yet, inside the soaring arches of Notre Dame, a strange warmth bloomed. Gold was everywhere, draped in the rafters, woven into velvet, poured onto the robes of men who once spoke of equality. The people had gathered, nobles, generals, priests. The revolutionaries had sworn an oath. No more crowns. But this morning, the revolution lay silent, beneath silks and ceremony, and at the center of it all, Napoleon, in a soldier's coat, but in an imperial robe of crimson and fur. Roman in its symbolism, meticulous in its message. He stood not beneath a cross, but beneath a banner of his own design. A golden eagle replacing the fleur-de-lis. A republic's son, cloaked now in empire. Across from him stood the Pope, Pius VII, summoned from Rome, not to bless a monarch, but to bear witness. The cathedral was thick with incense. The air itself seemed to whisper, "This is no coronation. This is theater." And the people outside, they waited in silence, wrapped in scarves, breathing frost. Because in that moment, whether they knew it or not, France was shifting again, not back to Bourbon kings. Not to divine right, but to something ancient, reborn in gunpowder and ambition. How did it come to this? It began years earlier, with whispers in the consulate. Napoleon, the victorious general, the bringer of peace, was already ruling France in all but name. He had crushed royalist plots. He had silenced Jacobin threats. He had made ministers into servants, and governors into tools. He redrew the laws, the Napoleonic Code, made fathers into rulers of the household. It stripped women of power. It preserved property. It rewarded obedience. But to many, it was order. After 10 years of revolution, of executions, of famine and fear, order was irresistible. Napoleon restored the church carefully. The Concordat of 1801 welcomed Catholicism back into public life. But the Pope would no longer choose bishops. No priest would rise without the emperor's approval. Even religion, he believed, must march in formation. They accepted it. They celebrated it. Because with Napoleon came roads and bread and pride. He built public schools for boys designed to mold future officials, engineers, soldiers. He gave France a central bank, a currency worth trusting. And above all, he gave them victory. Austerlitz, Marengo, ULM. Names that would etch themselves into the stone of memory. The army adored him. He marched beside them, ate with them. He was not a distant king. He was their commander, and yet each step forward was a step toward the crown. In 1802, the people voted to make him first consul for life, a new Roman title, a new ancient echo. But that too was not enough. In secret, plans were drawn. A new monarchy, but dressed in revolutionary garb, not a king by birth, an emperor by merit. An empire founded not on bloodlines, but on brilliance, or so they claimed. When news broke that he would crown himself emperor, the world paused. Some cheered, some wept, some warned. But the coronation proceeded, and on that cold December morning, in the full theater of Notre Dame, Pope Pius VII raised the crown. Napoleon took it from him. He turned, faced the people, and crowned himself. It was a gesture carved into history. "I am no man's puppet," it said. "I do not receive power. I seize it." Then he crowned. His wife not with love, but with ceremony. She knelt. He placed the crown gently, and for a moment it was quiet, not out of reverence, but awe. France had guillotined its king. It had chosen another, by a different name. The revolution was not dead, but it had changed, mutated. Its fire was now a torch held by one man, an emperor of the Republic, a monarch of merit, a soldier who wore Caesar's robes. Outside the cathedral, Parisians stood under gray skies, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Was it betrayal? Was it progress? Or was it simply the inevitable end of revolution? When chaos demands order and the people trade liberty, for greatness, the bells rang. Not for God, not for monarchy, but for empire. Power, like fire, burns brightest just before it consumes itself. Napoleon had the crown, the robes, the armies. But what he craved now was permanence. And permanence, he believed, came only through conquest. So he marched, crossed the Alps, through the valleys of Austria, into the cold heart of Prussia. At Austerlitz, he split the Russian and Austrian armies like a blade through silk. At Jena, he shattered the Prussian dream. At Wagram, he brought the Habsburgs to their knees. He rearranged Europe like chess pieces, created new kingdoms, placed his brothers on thrones like ornaments. Spain, Holland, Westphalia, he crowned them all, little Napoleons. And at the center stood the French Empire, radiating power like the sun. But beneath the gold, the cracks had already begun. The continental system, his attempt to strangle Britain's economy, choked his own ports instead. French merchants starved. Allies grew restless. In Spain, a slow, brutal guerrilla war dragged on. French soldiers were picked apart by shadows. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility began to rot. Then came Russia. He crossed into the vast, cold wilderness with over 600,000 men. Drums echoing across frozen soil. A grand army so large it swallowed the horizon. But the Russians did not fight. They burned, they fled, they lured him deeper, into snow, into silence. When he finally reached Moscow, it was already aflame. There was no victory, only ash. As winter howled across the steppe, Napoleon began his retreat. Frost turned breath into blood. Horses died where they stood. Men fell asleep in the snow and did not wake. Of the 600,000, fewer than 100,000 returned. The empire trembled. One by one, the nations he had humiliated rose again. Prussia, Austria, Britain, Russia, they joined hands, not for peace, but for vengeance. And still Napoleon fought. He returned to France, rallied new armies, promised glory, promised salvation. But his magic had faded. The crown felt heavier. In 1814, the Allies marched on Paris. The city surrendered. Napoleon abdicated. No trial, no execution, just exile. They sent him to Elba, a small island off the coast of Italy, caged with sea-four walls. But he would not remain caged for long. In 1815, he escaped, returned to France. And the people, tired of kings, tired of betrayal, welcomed him. He ruled again for 100 days. Then Waterloo. Rain soaked the fields, mud dragged the cannons. The Duke of Wellington, with Prussian support, shattered what remained of Napoleon's might. This time, there would be no Elba. He was sent to St. Helena, a desolate rock in the Atlantic. Far from Europe, far from history, far from memory. There, he walked alone, wrote, brooded, and slowly decayed. He died in 1821. Some say it was stomach cancer, others whisper of poison. But the truth, he died the same way his empire had. Bitterly, surrounded by silence. And yet, even in death, he lived. His legend grew. In paintings, in poems, in the minds of those who longed for greatness, he had been a tyrant, a reformer, a genius, a traitor to the Republic, a son of the Revolution who crowned himself king. But in his shadow, Europe was never the same. He redrew borders, inspired laws, terrified monarchs, and made every general after him feel small. Napoleon Bonaparte, the boy from Corsica, the general of Italy, the Consul of France, the emperor of Europe. He rose not by birth, but by brilliance. And though his empire turned to dust, his name never did. Because long after the crown fell, the echo remained. And so, another crown sank into the silence of history. Napoleon's story was not just a rise, it was a mirror, reflecting what happens when ambition meets chaos, when republics dream of order, and when one man decides that destiny belongs not to bloodlines, but to will. Empires fall, but the echo of power never fully disappears. If this story stirred something in you, a quiet curiosity, a flicker of memory, stay with us. There are more ruins to walk, more shadows to follow, more whispers from the past waiting to be heard. Subscribe and return when the night is quiet. We'll be here, telling the stories that history tried to bury softly and in the dark.